For decades, whispers have trailed through the marble corridors of Buckingham Palace, rumors of secret fights, silent treachery, and backroom maneuvers hidden just out of view. And now, in an action that borders on the thunderclap rather than the decree, King Charles has delivered a blow no one anticipated. With the signing of his name, he wiped Queen Camilla's entire family from the line of succession. Consider that for a moment. This is not just bureaucracy, and it is not just procedure. This is a violent cutting loose, an unprecedented move leaving in its wake a record of destroyed bonds, shattered lives, and a marriage now hanging in the balance. Why would Charles do this? And why now, when the crown itself seems more tenuous than it has in decades? The news wasn't sugar-coated in ceremony. No trumpets blared, no balcony waves. Nothing but the harsh ink of a signature, biting like a knife through blood and history. Inside the palace, aides stood still, mid-step. Whispers turned into gasps. They knew this was no simple reorganization of titles. This was an excision, a whole branch of power pulled out at the root. Some nodded in agreement quietly, grumbling that this day had been a long time coming. To them, Camilla's family members had been intruding too much, their increasing presence perilous to sully the Holy Windsor bloodline. But there were others who saw merely treachery, a cruel rejection of Camilla's sacrifices, of the unity Charles had sworn to defend, and beyond the palace gates, the country divided in half. In pubs and sitting rooms, some had cheered, remarking the monarchy was safe at last in William, George, and Charlotte's hands, but others shuddered in shock, appalled at the ruthlessness of it all. Was this justice done, or revenge dressed up as royal responsibility? But here's the question nobody is brave enough to shout too loudly. Did Charles make this decision willingly, or was his hand forced? Was this truly an act of courage, or a concession to the unrelenting pressure from those who have always quietly murmured that the future lay not in Camilla's line, but in William's and his descendants? Watch Charles closely in the days that followed. His face revealed the secret his lips never would. Eyes darkened, jaw set, spirit thinned. This was no victorious king. This was a man with his back against the wall, weighed down by decades of negotiation and tormented by voices that never reminded him loudly enough that his crown was on loan, his legacy contingent. And in that irony is the cruelest contradiction. The same edict intended to impose order has instead promoted anarchy. Yes, Charles might have cemented the Windsor legacy on paper, but in doing so has sparked a firestorm risking engulfing not just his marriage, but the solidity of the entire monarchy. Already, rumors whisper Camilla's anger is beyond anything the palace has ever encountered. Already, gossip spreads that her family will not slink away in silence. They will not disappear into the night. They will battle, tooth and nail, for what was stolen. And if they do, they won't just be contesting Charles. They'll be rocking the monarchy itself at its core. But in order to really get why Charles made the infamous cut, we must look beneath the crown and strip away the velvet layers. Because this didn't occur overnight. This was years in the making. A silent war waged not on battlefields, but in drawing rooms, behind gilded doors, and in the subtle machinations of Camilla's nascent dynasty. Her children, her grandchildren, her friends, all unbaptized Windors, but all gradually, painstakingly insinuating themselves into royal life. Appearance by appearance, step by step, they materialized. Not merely as family, but as additions to Camilla's crown. And to some in the palace, it was beginning to seem less like acceptance, and more like invasion. The storm was raging long before Charles put pen to paper. And when the reports arrived on his desk, revealing secrets too treacherous to be overlooked, he had no option but to respond. Because what these documents showed wasn't merely ambition. It was betrayal. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where the story truly begins. Refined, convincing, but irresistibly hazardous. That's the way the evidence looked when it came to Charles's desk. Accounts so cold, they turned rumors into evidence. What those pages showed was more than greed. They revealed insider politics, backroom bargains, behind-the-scenes efforts to usurp titles and prerogatives only those born Windsor could claim. And for Charles, who had lived his whole life readying himself to uphold the dignity of the throne, it was nothing short of treason. This was no longer palace rumor. This was no longer a thing to be waved away with a smile, discounted by denial. It was fact. Hard, written, inescapable. But proof was not what brought him peace. Proof tormented him. For the man who now sat on the throne was still the husband committed to the woman who had been by his side for so many years. And in the shadow of Clarence House, Charles had to make the most ruthless of decisions. Betray his wife, or betray the monarchy. Picture the anguish of those nights. A king walking his halls until morning, eyes red-rimmed, mind afire. Hour by hour weighing more than the last. To move against Camilla's family would be war in his marriage. Not to move would be gambling with the very existence of the monarchy itself. Can you envision the burden of that silence? The isolation of a man between heart and heritage? And then, into this tempest stepped Princess Anne, his sister. his steadfast mirror. Anne has never been a woman who hesitated, never one to sugarcoat the truth. She stepped into Charles's maelstrom with piercing clearness that cut where letters and reports could not. In a quiet showdown, she gazed her brother in the face and spoke the words that brooked no turning back. This cannot continue. Anne was not held to the crown by fear, nor to Camilla by loyalty. She stood by duty to the crown, to their mother's memory, and to the future. And the weight of her words was that of Elizabeth II herself, penetrating deeper than any paper document, for they issued not from sheet, but from kin. With each sleepless night, Charles's health began to disintegrate along with his sanity. His shoulders hunched lower, his face gaunt, his very being obscured beneath the weight. Those memos did not rest comfortably on his desk. They taunted him like specters, crying out for action with each tick of each clock. And ultimately, they spurred him into action. The decree which he signed would not become known as an expression of strength. It was a product of desperation, of an individual cornered, a king holding on to what little sense of monarchy there was. But even while ink said upon paper, the real fight was just starting. For the monarchy has never been defined by documents, by paper. It is defined by people. And people, when hurt, strike back. The fissures in Charles and Camilla's marriage became impossible to deny. In public, they continued to smile for photographers, that spit-shine veneer of togetherness. But behind palace walls, rage held sway. For Camilla, the edict wasn't merely a blow against her clan, it was the destruction of her life's work. Decades of compromise, decades endured braving outrage and contempt, decades fought clawing toward respectability, all for naught with a stroke of a pen. And Charles, he stared at her fury and saw evidence of his darkest fear, that she had never been loyal to him, but to her line. Their fights became fierce, everyone more biting than the bitter winds that howled at Buckingham Palace. Staff spoke in hushed tones of loud arguments ringing through the corridors, voices ringing long after midnight. A king once famous for restraint now escalated his pitch with desperation, pleading to know whether his wife had ever been his partner, or whether she had always constructed her own dynasty. Camilla retorted in kind. To her, he had betrayed her. He had preferred William, Catherine, and their children to her, to them. And thus the rift grew, shattering their marriage with each angry word. Survival for Charles. For Camilla, it was a matter of personal heartbreak. She watched her sacrifices burn to ash, her family's rise into royal respectability trampled in a moment, and her anger did not perish within the walls of their rooms. It seeped outwards, nourishing her friends, her intimates, her inner circle. Those who had been raised alongside her now spoke of vengeance. If the king had sliced them off, they would bite back. If their crown was taken from them, they would reveal every confidence they had ever heard. And in a family already soaked in scandal, that promise had punch. The cost to Charles was undeniable. His health, previously frail, appeared to disintegrate under the constant pressure. He appeared paler, weaker, older by the week. Staff spotted him pacing the palace corridors at night, sleepless, only to struggle through the day in sheer exhaustion. He had become a man torn in two, between the throne he had at last secured and the marriage that was breaking around him. And Camilla? Her fury was audible, but silence was more sinister. The people around her started to see the silences after the rages, the times she'd cease shouting and drop into contemplation. Calculation existed there, a tempest brewing behind her eyes. Was she gearing up for a counterattack? Was she going to take the monarchy down on its knees in revenge? In the meantime, the coming generation could no longer stand by as spectators. William and Catherine, who had stood by silently for so many years, started preparing. Their children's rightful inheritance was being attacked, and now they would fight for it. William's resentment had been brewing for a long time, but Charles's proclamation finally gave him focus. Camilla's clan, in his opinion, had violated a hallowed boundary no stranger should ever have encroached upon. Each photo opportunity, each insidious bid for power, was an attack on the very fabric of the monarchy. And while he had endured much to maintain harmony, William understood that that time had run out. By his side was Catherine, as unfaltering as ever. Her resolve was softer, but just as strong. She penned letters to Charles herself, words filled with affection for him, but weighted with warning. "Our children are entitled to safety," she reminded him. These were not entreaties. These were statements, soft reminders that the future of the crown rested with George, Charlotte, and Louis, and she would not let that future be robbed. Those around the couple started to change. Those in the palace who had been on the fence began moving towards William and Catherine. Aides tired of too much of Camilla's rule edged a little closer, sharing their insider knowledge, making the air stronger. Rumors of discontentedness crystallized into actions of devotion. What had been incoherent resistance was turning into a movement. They never lost sight. It was always the children. George, the future king who would eventually wear the crown, was the face of it all. Charlotte and Louis, younger but still a representation of the perpetuation of a century-old dynasty. This was no longer a debate about preferences or personalities. It was a matter of survival. The monarchy needed to stay Windsor. It could not be taken over by those who had wed into power, but were never born to take it. And in Princess Anne, William and Catherine discovered a force of nature. Anne was their anchor, their moral compass, and their voice of reason. William's relationship with his aunt deepened, wedded to common frustration and a common commitment to Elizabeth's legacy. Anne reminded him of a truth too often lost. The crown can be heavy, but it is duty, not power, that upholds it. Together, their voices had become more powerful, more unbreakable. And what was initially a diffuse resistance had become something much more, a collective front poised to challenge Camilla's increasing power. The backdrop was set for a battle unlike anything the contemporary monarchy had faced. If William and Catherine represented the face of opposition, Anne represented its flames. And flames once ignited cannot be muzzled. At a meeting that rocked the palace to its foundations, Anne came straight at Charles. The king, weary of weeks of upheaval, had summoned his most senior advisors, pleading for calm. What he was met with instead was his sister's wrath. Anne did not mince words. "You are destroying the queen's legacy," she spat, her voice unflinching, her eyes fixed on his. Those words, infused with the memory of Elizabeth II, cut through the room like a sword. Charles recognized at once that this was no throwaway comment. It was judgment, final, imminent, and Anne did not let it go. She spoke of their mother's private cautionary tales, whispers imparted in confidence regarding the risks of allowing Camilla's aspirations to run amok. "She told you this could happen," Anne insisted, her voice weighed down not with fury, but with grief. And in that moment, Charles realized the truth. The battle was no longer just about Camilla. It was about the crown itself. And still, Anne pressed, her voice unwavering, "You've let her family creep into places they never belonged." The room was stilled. Witnesses would later whisper that in that moment, the air itself seemed to thicken. The burden of their mother's memory weighed heavily over every soul present. Even Charles's most ardent supporters, those who had stood by him scandal after scandal, could not protect him from the stark reality of his sister's words. Charles had borne so many weights for years. Camilla loyalty, institutional duty, scars of a broken heart never fully mended. But then Anne spoke and cut to the quick where no aide, no advisor, no competitor had ever been able to penetrate. And finally, his facade crumbled. Witnesses said they could see tears well up in his eyes, his voice shaking as he attempted, and failed, to justify his decisions. The English king, brought low by his sister's judgment, but Anne did not back down. No. She pushed on, merciless, using her dedication to the crown like a sword of fire. And then, the hammer blow that sealed his destiny. Proof. Papers, witness statements, irrefutable testimony, all presented to him. Facts collected not in rumor, but in pen and fact. Anne exposed the reality. Camilla's clan had not just profited from her throne, they'd conspired, manipulated, schemed to warp palace hierarchies for their benefit. Charles shook as he read. His hands trembled, his face pale. What was spoken in dark alleys now stood in the light, irrefutable. Betrayal no longer whispered, but shouted. And it cried out for justice. That evening, Charles's resolution crystallized. He would sign the decree, not due to advisors, not due to politics, but because his sister had compelled him to confront what he could no longer hide from. To do nothing was to put the very monarchy at risk. Anne's action was decisive, her courage unquestionable. At that moment, she wasn't just Charles's sister, she was the ghost of their mother. The voice of Elizabeth II returned, the keeper of a tradition too holy to be forsaken. But don't think it worked. Anne's fiery protest didn't stop the fight. It threw the match. It released a war Camilla's family would never tolerate in silence. Yes, the decree was signed. Yes, titles were removed. But Camilla's family did not disappear quietly. They fought back, angry, determined to claw back what they felt had been taken from them. Their revolt started nearly at once. Initially, it was defiance. Family members who were supposed to fade into the background refused to relinquish their position. They went on attending functions, went on basking in the radiance of Camilla's coronation, as if nothing was different. Their intransigent presence was a quiet rebellion, a direct affront to the king himself. It was a bold step, challenging his will in the full glare of the international spotlight. What should have been a clean break instead became a festering wound, and then the leaks. Seeping through cracks, so carefully seeded stories had begun to appear in the media. Anonymous rumors described Charles as weak, frail, manipulated by William, by Anne, and by Catherine as well. The tabloids speculated about whether the king was truly worthy to rule, or whether his crown had already become a hollow shell supported by louder voices around him. Each leak was calculated, each front-page headline a knife thrust into his legitimacy. And the public, never unwilling to salivate over scandal, gobbled it all up. Camilla herself remained quiet. In well-timed appearances, she made suggestions, mysterious, incisive hints that there were secrets. Secrets, she suggested, that if uncovered might topple the monarchy from within. She never explained. She never elucidated. And in that silence, she used the deadliest weapon of all: doubt. What secrets did she mean? Were they old scandals, long buried? Or revelations so explosive they could topple the fragile balance of royal power? By leaving the nation guessing, she left the monarchy dangling on a thread. The tabloids indulged. Front pages hollered betrayal, revenge, ulterior motives, and scandal. The public divided deeper still. Some sympathized with Camilla as the victim, a lady who had been betrayed by the man for whom she had given up everything. Others rallied behind Charles, believing his edict the only way to protect the Windsor heritage. The monarchy, once a unifying symbol, was now the focus of a maniacal national debate. And within the palace walls, there was panic. Narrative control was ebbing away. For each carefully crafted announcement from the king's advisors, there was another destructive leak. For each manufactured display of William and Catherine's unity, there was another rumor that spoke of division and rot. This was no longer a royal feud in private. This was a war fought in headlines, battled in whispers, resolved on the changing allegiances of an exhausted public. And the longer it burned, the weaker the monarchy's image grew. And then came the turnabout no one saw coming. Charles made a final gesture, a gesture that laid bare his heart and broke the distance between monarch and man. In a rare, tearful speech, the king addressed the nation directly. His voice shook, his eyes brimming with tears. For the first time, the mask of smooth restraint was shed. Millions listened in shocked silence as he declared that this war was not for politics, not power, but for survival. He admitted that the wars raging through his palace had entered his marriage, shattering the union that was to be his shelter. He admitted, in voice heavy as rocks, that betrayal had not only come from external agents, but from within himself. For the first time, the world heard Charles not as a sovereign, but as a man crushed beneath the weight of choices that could never be undone. He admitted that the decree had not been born from ambition, nor cold calculation, but desperation to protect William, Catherine, and their children, to ensure that what they inherited was whole, not broken. His words hung there like a prayer. He talked of sleepless nights, of a battered conscience between duty and love, of the oppressive silence that trailed every fight with Camilla. His voice broke as he spoke the truth. He had given up his marriage for the crown. The country's response was swift and polarized. Some cried along with him, touched by the humanity of a king at last bereft of protocol, laid bare as a father, a brother, a man. Others shuddered, wondering if this was vulnerability or weakness. Was this the bravery of openness, or the unmaking of a monarch too weak for the tempests of rule? What could not be withheld was the wound his confession drew across the monarchy. It was not some deliberately honed remark cleared through aids. It was raw, irreparable. He had pulled up the curtain and shown the palace not as a citadel of tradition, but as a battleground of betrayal and loss. And even as his candor moved hearts, it also asked one question too perilous to be avoided. If the king himself acknowledged such cracks, could the monarchy ever hope to recover? At the end of his speech, Charles gazed out from the camera, his voice barely above a whisper but laden with portent. This fight is not over. They hung in the air like thunder. They brooked no ambiguity. The storm was hardly spent. Camilla's family might have been excluded from succession, but their shadows still lingered. Their silence was not submission. It was preparation. For William, Catherine, and their kids, the future now balanced on a knife's edge. George, Charlotte, and Louis, beacons of hope. Inheritors of a crown tarnished by betrayal, were at the center of a dynasty remolded by their grandfather's desperate proclamation. Theirs was the protection of innocence, but their lives already determined by foes repelled in anger. Every choice today weighed against their tomorrow. The monarchy's existence had been bound to their fates, and that reality could not be reversed. But fear lingered, hinted in hallways and shouted in headlines. Camilla was not done. Silence was not peace, it was tact. Memoirs, secrets, covert truths, any one of them might be the spark that incinerated the monarchy. The country divided once more. For some, Charles's decree was a triumph, a final vindication of Windsor purity. For others, it was evidence of desperation, a blow that would never be healed. And in the turmoil, one person stood as the unshakable pillar, Princess Anne. In her, the people saw continuity, a living reminder of Elizabeth II's duty and devotion. She became the guardian of a legacy, but even Anne knew her strength was not infinite. Loyalty alone could not secure the future. Speculation ran rampant. Would Charles abdicate? His illness, his grief, his failed marriage, had the crown already been too much for him? Would he relinquish it to William, passing the throne to the son now heir and savior? Or would he hold on, vowing to survive even the tempest he had set in motion? No one knew, and the question itself added to the uncertainty plaguing the country, and thus the monarchy now teeters on the precipice. Camilla's family might be excluded from succession, but the conflict she sparked smolders in the background. William and Catherine's children might be the future, but that future is far from certain. This is not the end. This is only the beginning. The monarchy has ridden out the centuries of turmoil, but never one such as this. As history writes its next page, there's one truth that rings out louder than ever. Time will tell who really wears the crown. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stick with us as we continue to shed light on the royal wars that shape the future.